The cold was a thief. It crept under the door of the small apartment, stealing the last of the day's warmth from the floorboards. For 7-year-old Lily, it felt like a living thing, a gray monster that had swallowed her mother whole. She sat on the worn floral sofa, her small legs tucked beneath her, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, skeletal shadows across the living room. The silence in the apartment was louder than any noise she had ever heard. It was a heavy, pressing silence, filled with the questions she was too scared to ask out loud. Where was Mom? Why hadn't she come home from her shift at the diner? She was never this late. Never. Lily had eaten the last of the cereal for dinner, dry from the box because the milk had run out yesterday. She had checked the clock again, its glowing red numbers mocking her with the time, 9:47 p.m. Hours had passed since her mom's shift was supposed to end. Lily had tried calling her phone, but it went straight to a message that said the user was unavailable. She knew her mom's phone was old, the battery unreliable, but a knot of dread tightened in her stomach anyway. She was a good girl. She knew the rules. Don't open the door for anyone. Don't use the stove. If there's an emergency, call Mrs. Henderson next door. But Mrs. Henderson's lights were off, her car gone for the weekend to visit her grandchildren. Lily was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her gaze drifted to the front door. Earlier, just after the sun had set, she had heard a soft scraping sound. Peeking through the peephole, her heart hammering against her ribs, she had seen him. Mr. Abernathy, the landlord. He wasn't knocking. He was fiddling with the lock. He had a key, of course, for emergencies. But this didn't feel like an emergency. It felt like a secret. He hadn't come in. After a moment, he'd simply walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. But the sound had changed something. The click of the lock settling had felt final, different. It was the sound of a cage door closing. A deep, instinctual fear, older than her 7 years, told her that waiting was no longer an option. She had to do something. She had to find help. But the world outside her door was a vast, dark place, full of strangers. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a constant refrain of caution. Don't talk to people you don't know, Lilybug. The world isn't always a kind place. But the world inside her apartment was no longer kind either. It was cold and empty and silent. Steeling herself, she slid off the couch. She put on her worn sneakers, not bothering with socks, and pulled on the thin pink jacket that was her favorite. She grabbed the small, slightly crumpled drawing from the fridge, a picture of her and her mom holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. It was her most prized possession. She tucked it carefully into her jacket pocket, a paper talisman, against the encroaching dark. She went to the door and tried the knob. It wouldn't turn. It was locked from the outside. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Mr. Abernathy had locked her in. Why? Why would he do that? The window, the living room window, looked out over the fire escape. It was old and heavy, but her mom had shown her how to open it once, during a hot summer day when the air was thick and still. "Just in case, sweetie," she had said. "Always have a way out." Lily dragged a kitchen chair over, its legs scraping loudly against the floor. She climbed onto it, her small hands struggling with the stiff latch. For a moment, it wouldn't budge. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. She took a deep breath, picturing her mom's strong hands, and pushed with all her might. The latch gave way with a groan. The window slid up just enough for her to squeeze through. The night air was sharp and smelled of rain. The metal of the fire escape was cold and gritty beneath her palms. She moved slowly, carefully, her sneakers making soft, tapping sounds on the steps. Down below, the street seemed a world away. car headlights swept past, indifferent. When her feet finally touched the damp pavement of the alley, a wave of relief washed over her, quickly followed by a new, more profound sense of being lost. She was out. But she was still alone. Where could she go? The police station was too far to walk. She didn't know anyone else's phone number by heart. Then she heard it, a low, rhythmic rumble that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. It grew louder, a deep-throated growl that was both intimidating and strangely steady. Around the corner, a line of motorcycles was parked in front of a small, brightly lit diner, the same one her mom sometimes picked up extra shifts at. Big men in leather vests stood outside, talking and laughing, their forms silhouetted against the diner's warm glow. They were the kind of men her mom had warned her about. Loud, rough, intimidating. But their presence was a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. They were alive. They were here. And right now, that was more than she had. Taking another shaky breath, clutching the drawing in her pocket, Lily walked out of the alley and toward the rumbling engines and the circle of giants. Lily's life had been a duet of love and struggle for as long as she could remember. Her mother, Sarah, was the sun in her small universe. She worked tirelessly, a constant blur of motion, juggling a full-time job at the diner and a part-time cleaning gig at an office building downtown. Her hands were often rough with work, but her touch was always gentle. She smelled of coffee and disinfectant and the faint, sweet scent of the rosewater lotion she used when she could afford it. Their apartment was small, filled with second-hand furniture and the quiet hum of a refrigerator that was never quite full enough, but Sarah had a gift for making it a home. She would hang lilies, drawings on the walls, transforming their cramped space into a vibrant art gallery. She would read stories to Lily every night, her voice a soft, soothing melody that chased away the shadows. But beneath the warmth, there was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. Bills were a constant worry. The rent was always a tightrope walk. Lily learned to read the lines of tension in her mother's face, to know when to be quiet, when to offer a hug, when to simply sit beside her and hold her hand, while she stared at a stack of envelopes on the kitchen table. Their world had shrunk considerably a year ago, when they had to move after their old building was sold. This new apartment, managed by Mr. Abernathy, was cheaper, but felt colder, the walls thinner. Mr. Abernathy had seemed nice at first. He had a polished smile and a voice that was smooth and reassuring. He called Lily kiddo and had once given her a lollipop. He told Sarah he understood the struggles of a single parent and promised to be flexible with the rent if she ever fell behind. "We have to look out for each other in this community," he'd said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. But his kindness had sharp edges. He would show up unannounced, using his master key to let himself in to check on a pipe or inspect a fixture. Each time, his presence lingered a little too long. He would stand too close to Sarah, his gaze roaming over their small apartment with a proprietary air that made Lily's skin crawl. A few months ago, the kitchen sink had developed a persistent drip. Sarah had called him, and he'd arrived that evening with a toolbox. Lily had been in her room, coloring, but she could hear their voices. Mr. Abernathy's tone was low and syrupy. He was talking about how hard it must be for a woman on her own. "A pretty thing like you," he'd said, his voice dropping lower, "shouldn't have to worry about all this." Lily heard her mom's voice, polite but firm. "I can manage, Mr. Abernathy, thank you. Is the faucet fixed?" There was a pause, and then Mr. Abernathy's voice colder now. "For now. But things break. It's good to have someone around who knows how to fix them. Someone you can rely on." After he left, Lily found her mom leaning against the counter, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale. She didn't say anything, but the air in the apartment felt heavy and wrong. The next day, Sarah bought a rubber doorstop and started wedging it under the front door every night. That small act of defiance seemed to change things. Mr. Abernathy's visits became less frequent, but his notes started appearing. Tucked into their door, written in a neat, precise script, they were reminders about rent being due a day early, complaints about noise that they had never made, warnings about violating obscure clauses in their lease. Each note was a small, calculated prick, a reminder of his power over their fragile stability. Lily felt the weight of her mother's fear without ever being told about it directly. She saw it in the way Sarah jumped every time there was a knock at the door, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes after a phone call with the landlord. Lily started having nightmares where she was trapped in a room with no doors, the walls slowly closing in. She drew pictures of monsters with friendly faces and sharp, hidden teeth. Her isolation grew in tandem with her mother's anxiety. She didn't have many friends at school. It was hard to invite people over when she was never sure if her mom would be home or if Mr. Abernathy might decide to show up. She learned to be self-reliant, to make her own snacks, to entertain herself for hours with just a book and her imagination. She became a silent observer, noticing the small details others missed. The way Mr. Abernathy's smile never matched his cold, assessing eyes. The way he seemed to enjoy making her mother uncomfortable. The last time she'd seen her mom was that morning. Sarah had kissed her goodbye, her face etched with weariness. "I have to pull a double, Lilybug," she'd whispered, stroking her hair. "Mrs. Henderson will look in on you after school. I'll be home late, but I'll be here before you wake up, I promise." But Mrs. Henderson had left a note on the door saying she'd been called away for a family emergency. And now the promise was broken. The sun had set, and the apartment had grown cold, and her mom was still not home. Clutching the drawing in her pocket, the paper now soft and worn from her anxious grip, Lily understood a terrifying truth. This wasn't just about her mom being late. It was about the doorstop that had gone missing last week. It was about the new, strange click the lock made. It was about Mr. Abernathy's smiling, monstrous face. Her fear was no longer a vague, shadowy thing. It had a name, and it had a key to her front door. The Iron Ravens Motorcycle Club was not what most people imagined. From the outside, their clubhouse, a sprawling converted auto shop on the industrial edge of town, looked menacing. The windows were dark, the metal door imposing. The emblem on their leather vests, a stoic raven with wings of steel, spoke of hardness and defiance. But inside, the club operated on a code as rigid and unyielding as the chrome on their bikes. It was a code of loyalty, discipline, and a quiet, fierce protectiveness that was rarely seen by outsiders. The president of the club, a man known only as Bear, set the tone. He was built like a mountain, with a thick beard streaked with gray and hands that could bend steel but were surprisingly gentle when fixing a child's broken toy. A former combat medic who had seen the worst of humanity, he had returned home with a profound, unshakable belief. The true measure of strength was not in the harm you could inflict, but in the harm you could prevent. He had founded the Iron Ravens with a handful of other veterans, men who, like him, felt adrift in a world that no longer made sense. They found purpose not in chaos, but in order. Their weekly meetings were run with military precision. Their finances were meticulously managed by Doc, a retired lawyer who could dissect a legal contract as skillfully as he could a carburetor. Their security was overseen by Ghost, a quiet, wiry man who seemed to move without making a sound and noticed everything. He had been a scout in the service, and his instincts were preternaturally sharp. The club's reputation in the community was complicated. The police kept a wary eye on them, and some locals crossed the street to avoid them. But those who knew them, the families they helped with their annual toy drive, the soup kitchen where they volunteered on holidays, the local woman whose abusive ex-husband had been calmly and permanently persuaded to leave town, knew the truth. The Ravens were a wall. They stood between the vulnerable and the predatory. This protective instinct was born from their own histories. Bear carried a faded photograph of a daughter he had lost to a drunk driver, a grief that had carved itself into his soul and fueled his mission. Doc had spent his legal career defending battered women, a thankless job that had shown him the deep cracks in the justice system. Ghost had grown up in a series of foster homes, learning early that the only safety he could rely on was the one he created himself. They were not saints. They were hard men who had seen hardship and had made their share of mistakes. But they shared a common, unspoken vow. They would not stand by while the innocent suffered. They had all seen what happened when good people looked away. That evening, they were gathered at the diner after a long charity ride, raising money for a new children's wing at the local hospital. The air was filled with the easy camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their lives. They were tired, road-worn, and satisfied. Bear was nursing a cup of black coffee, listening to Doc recount a ridiculous story about a flat tire when he felt a small, hesitant tug on his leather vest. He looked down and saw her. A little girl, no older than 7, with wide, frightened eyes and a face smudged with dirt. She was trembling, her small frame swallowed by a thin pink jacket. She looked like a lost sparrow, fragile and out of place among the leather and chrome. The noise and laughter around them seemed to fade into a dull hum. Bear's focus narrowed entirely on the child. His voice, normally a low rumble, softened. "Hey there, little one. Are you lost?" The girl shook her head, her chin quivering. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She took a shaky breath, and her voice, though barely a whisper, cut through the night with a devastating clarity. "My mom's still not home." It was the "still" that hit him like a punch to the gut. It spoke of hours of waiting, of hope dwindling, of a child's world slowly tilting off its axis. Ghost was suddenly at his side, silent and watchful, his eyes scanning the street. Doc had stopped talking, his expression shifting from amusement to concern. The entire group of men fell quiet, their attention drawn to the small, trembling girl who had breached their circle. Bear knelt down, bringing himself to her level. He was careful to keep his movements slow, his posture non-threatening. He knew that to her, he must look like a monster from a fairy tale. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and steady. "What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered. "Okay, Lily, my name is Bear. These are my brothers. We're going to help you. Can you tell me where you live?" She pointed a small, trembling finger down the dark street. "In the apartments, over there." Then she added the detail that made the hairs on Bear's arms stand on end. "Mr. Abernathy, the landlord, he locked our door from the outside. He said he was going to take care of the problem. He has a key." The word "problem" hung in the air, thick with unspoken menace. Bear's combat medic instincts kicked in. This was a triage situation. The child was the primary casualty, and her words were the vital signs. He saw the truth in her wide, terrified eyes. Children, in his experience, didn't lie about this kind of fear. It was too raw, too real. He looked up at Ghost, who gave a short, sharp nod. He had already seen it too. This wasn't a case of a neglectful parent. This was something else, something predatory. Bear turned his full attention back to Lily. He made a promise not just to her, but to the memory of his own daughter. "Don't you worry, Lily," he said, his voice a low, solid vow. We're going to find your mom." The intersection of a child's terror and a brotherhood's purpose is a powerful, combustible thing. In that moment, outside the diner, the world shifted. The Iron Ravens were no longer just a group of men unwinding after a long ride. They were an activated unit. Bear's calm authority settled over them like a weighted blanket. There was no panic, no shouting, just a quiet, focused energy. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over his men. "Ghost, you stay with her. Doc, get her some hot chocolate. No questions, just keep her warm and safe." Ghost knelt beside Lily, his presence surprisingly gentle for such a formidable man. He didn't crowd her. He simply created a protective space around her, a silent promise that nothing else would get through. Doc went inside the diner, emerging moments later with a steaming mug that he placed carefully into Lily's small, cold hands. She looked up at Bear, her eyes still wide with fear, but a flicker of trust had begun to kindle within them. She had reached out into the darkness, and something had reached back. Bear turned to two other members, Jax and Cutter. "You two with me. We're going to have a conversation with the landlord." The walk to the apartment building was short and silent. The building itself was a nondescript 3-story brick structure, with several dark windows that looked like vacant eyes. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled of stale air and cleaning fluid. The directory on the wall listed Abernathy Properties, Unit 1A, as the management office. Bear led the way, his heavy boots making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. He knocked on the door of Unit 1A. The sound was solid, firm, and patient. It was not the knock of aggression, but of inevitability. After a moment, the door opened a crack, held by a chain. A man's face appeared in the gap. He was in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair, a soft cardigan, and a smile that was practiced and placid. It was a face designed to inspire confidence, the face of a reasonable man. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice smooth as butter. His eyes flickered over their leather vests, a hint of disdain in his polite expression. "We're looking for Sarah," Bear said, his voice level. "Lily's mother, from apartment 3B. Abernathy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes, Sarah. A troubled woman, I'm afraid, and little Lily, such an imagination on that one. Is there a problem?" "Her mother isn't home," Bear stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Lily's worried. She said you were here earlier, said you locked her door." The landlord's practiced calm began to fray at the edges. He let out a condescending chuckle. "Gentlemen, you have to understand. Sarah, she's not the most reliable tenant. Often late with rent, men coming and going. I was simply securing the property after she appeared to have abandoned it." The girl must be confused. The dismissal, the casual character assassination of a woman he held power over, solidified the cold certainty in Bear's gut. This was the kind of predator he recognized, one who used whispers and paperwork as weapons. "Lily says her mother was supposed to be home hours ago," Bear pressed, his voice unwavering. "She says you told her you were taking care of a problem." At the mention of that specific word, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed Abernathy's face before being quickly masked by indignation. "This is ridiculous. I am a respected property manager. I will not be intimidated by people like you. Now, if you'll excuse me." He tried to close the door. Bear didn't move. He simply placed his hand flat against the wood, stopping it cold. He didn't push, he didn't threaten, he just held it there, an immovable object. The pressure was immense, but it was entirely psychological. "We're not leaving without answers," Bear said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "The girl is 7 years old. She's alone and she's terrified. You locked her in her apartment. A child." So you're going to open this door and we're going to talk, or my friend here." He nodded towards Jax, who was dialing his phone, "is going to call the police and tell them a landlord has illegally locked a minor in her home, and that her mother is now missing. Your choice." The polished veneer of Mr. Abernathy cracked. His face, which had been a mask of concerned community stewardship, now showed the pinched, ugly lines of a cornered rat. His eyes darted back and forth between the three large men standing in his hallway. He saw no anger in their faces, no wildness. He saw something far more terrifying: absolute resolve. With a trembling hand, he unlatched the chain. The confrontation that followed was not a physical one. It was a battle of wills fought in the sterile, beige office of Abernathy Properties. Abernathy sat behind his large, tidy desk, attempting to regain his composure and authority. Bear, Jax, and Cutter remained standing, their presence filling the small room, making it feel claustrophobic. They were a silent, leather-clad jury. "Her mother left," Abernathy insisted, shuffling papers on his desk, avoiding their eyes. "She was behind on rent. She packed a bag and left the girl. It's a sad situation, but it has nothing to do with me." "Lily didn't say anything about a packed bag," Bear countered. "She said her mom was coming right back from work. She said her school books are on the table, and her toothbrush is in the bathroom. That doesn't sound like someone who abandoned their child." Abernathy's hands stilled. That small domestic detail, so mundane yet so powerful, was a direct contradiction to his narrative. He had underestimated the child. He had assumed she was just a hysterical kid, not a credible witness. He licked his lips, a nervous gesture that betrayed his mounting panic. Children get confused. They misremember things. "She remembered the new scratch on the lock," Cutter said, his voice a low growl. "The one your key made when you locked her in." A bead of sweat trickled down Abernathy's temple. The truth was beginning to surface, pushed into the light by the unblinking, steady pressure of the men in front of him. The power in the room had irrevocably shifted. It no longer belonged to the man behind the desk with the leases and the keys. It belonged to the little girl who had dared to run for help, and to the men who had listened. The arrival of the police did little to diffuse the tension. It merely changed its form. 2 officers responded to the call: a veteran cop named Miller with a weary, cynical face, and his younger, more by-the-book partner. Detective Miller's first impression was exactly what Abernathy had counted on. He saw 3 intimidating bikers in a tense standoff with a well-dressed, respectable-looking local businessman. His professional skepticism immediately sided with the man in the cardigan. "All right, what's going on here?" Miller asked, his hand resting near his sidearm. Bear stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "This is Mr. Abernathy. He's the landlord for the little girl we called about, Lily. Her mother, Sarah, is missing. Mr. Abernathy locked the child in her apartment. Abernathy seized the opportunity to play the victim. Thank goodness you're here, officer. These men were harassing me. This is a simple misunderstanding. The girl's mother abandoned her, and I was securing the property. They've twisted the story." Miller looked from Bear to Abernathy, his expression unreadable. "And the girl? Where is she now?" "She's safe," Bear said firmly. "She's with one of my men at the diner down the street. She's scared." "I'll need to speak with her," Miller said, turning his attention to the landlord. "Mr. Abernathy, did you or did you not change the lock or otherwise prevent the child from leaving her apartment?" "I secured the deadbolt from the outside, officer, for her own safety," Abernathy said, his voice dripping with false concern. "The neighborhood isn't what it used to be. I was going to call social services first thing in the morning." It was a plausible lie. a story that fit neatly into a box of unfortunate but non-criminal circumstances. Miller seemed to be weighing it. The system was designed to believe men like Abernathy over men like Bear. But then the younger officer, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Sir, an illegal eviction and unlawful imprisonment of a minor are serious allegations. We should at least inspect the apartment." Miller sighed but nodded. Abernathy produced the key with a flourish of cooperation. As they walked up to 3B, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations. The apartment was just as Lily had described it. A half-finished bowl of dry cereal on the coffee table, school books open on the small kitchen table, a single coffee mug in the sink. It didn't look like a place that had been abandoned. It looked like a place where time had suddenly stopped. Miller's cynical exterior began to crack. He was a father himself. He knew what a home with a child in it felt like, and this was it. He knelt, examining the lock. He saw the fresh scratches on the metal plate, just as the biker had said. He sent his partner to the diner to interview Lily, with specific instructions to be gentle. While they waited, Bear stood silently in the hallway, his arms crossed. He did not interfere, but his presence was a constant reminder that he was not leaving. He was a witness, a guardian, and he would see this through. An hour later, the young officer returned from the diner. He pulled Miller aside, and his voice was low but urgent. "Sir, the kid, she's sharp. She's not confused. She's terrified of him," he said, nodding toward Abernathy. She gave a very clear timeline, and she said something else, something specific. Miller raised an eyebrow. "What?" She said, "Abernathy was always trying to fix things for her mom. A few weeks ago, he fixed her mother's music box, a little wooden one with a ballerina, but he didn't give it back. Lily saw it last week through the mail slot of his office door. She said it was sitting on the corner of his desk. This was the key. Not an accusation, not a feeling, but a piece of tangible, verifiable evidence. A child's toy in a landlord's office. It was a small, discordant detail that completely unraveled Abernathy's story. Why would a man have a tenant's music box on his desk? Miller's entire demeanor shifted. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He turned to Abernathy, his voice now devoid of any professional courtesy. "Mr. Abernathy, I'd like to take another look at your office." The color drained from Abernathy's face. That's an invasion of my privacy. You don't have a warrant." "I can get one," Miller said, his voice cold as steel. "And a judge isn't going to look kindly on a man who locks a 7-year-old in an apartment and has her missing mother's personal effects in his possession. Or we can do this the easy way. It's your choice." The facade crumbled completely. Abernathy knew he was trapped. The law, which he had so skillfully used as a tool of intimidation, was now turning against him. While Miller secured the warrant, news began to travel. Doc, using his legal expertise, made a few quiet phone calls to a child advocacy center and a contact at the local news. He knew that sunlight was the best disinfectant for this kind of rot. Lily's teacher, a woman named Ms. Albright, received a call from the advocacy center. She had always had a soft spot for Lily, a quiet, watchful child who drew pictures with an emotional depth that was startling. Hearing that Lily was safe, but that her mother was missing, Ms. Albright immediately drove to the diner. She arrived to find Lily asleep on a booth bench, curled up under Ghost's leather vest, with the big, silent man watching over her like a hawk. The sight of the fierce-looking biker gently guarding his sleeping student solidified her resolve. She wasn't just an ally. She was now part of the fight. The search for evidence was no longer just a police matter. It was becoming a community concern, a web of support quietly and quickly weaving itself around a little girl who had been invisible for too long. The execution of the search warrant was a quiet, methodical affair, but it set off a seismic shockwave through the community. As Detective Miller and his team entered Abernathy's office, the landlord sat in a chair in the hallway, his face a pasty gray, his composure shattered. The Iron Ravens remained outside the building, a silent, unmoving cordon. They weren't there to intimidate. They were there to bear witness. Their presence sent a clear, unspoken message. The truth will be seen. Inside the office, it didn't take long. On the corner of the meticulously organized desk, exactly as Lily had described, sat a small wooden music box with a ballerina. Tucked away in a desk drawer, they found Sarah's wallet and her old, cracked smartphone. But the most damning discovery was in a locked filing cabinet. It contained meticulously kept ledgers detailing a sickening pattern of predatory behavior. For years, Abernathy had been targeting vulnerable, single mothers in his properties. He would use his position of power to create a cycle of dependency and fear, offering help that came with unspoken strings, manufacturing lease violations to keep them off balance, and using illegal lockouts and the seizure of personal property as tools of control and intimidation. Sarah was not his first victim. She was just the first one whose child had found the courage to run. The discovery of Sarah's phone allowed the police to trace her last known location. The signal led them to a block of derelict properties Abernathy owned on the other side of town, slated for demolition. In a boarded-up, vacant apartment, they found her. She was alive, but weak and disoriented, having been drugged and locked in a back room. The relief that washed over Bear and his men when they heard the news was profound and unspoken. They had done it. They had found her. As Sarah was taken to the hospital, the story exploded. The local news, tipped off by Doc's contact, was on the scene, cameras rolling as a handcuffed and disheveled Mr. Abernathy was led from his building. The image of the respected property manager in police custody was broadcast across the city. The public reckoning had begun. The community, which had largely been ignorant of the quiet terrors happening in their midst, was forced to confront an ugly truth. The reactions were varied and immediate. Some expressed shock and disbelief, defending the man they knew from community board meetings and local charity events. Skeptics emerged online, questioning the involvement of a motorcycle club, suggesting they had somehow orchestrated the situation. But for every doubter, there were dozens of supporters. Miss Albright, Lily's teacher, organized a meeting for parents at the school. She spoke with passionate clarity about the need to listen to children, to believe them, and to look beyond surface-level respectability. The story of Lily's courage and the bikers who had answered her call for help became a local legend overnight. The defining moment of the public response came the next morning. As Abernathy was scheduled for his arraignment, a low rumble began to build on the outskirts of town. It grew from a distant hum to a ground-shaking roar. Led by Bear, the Iron Ravens rode toward the courthouse. But they were not alone. Word had spread through the network of motorcycle clubs across the state, clubs that shared a similar, if unspoken, code of protecting the innocent. From every direction they came. By the time they reached the downtown square, their numbers had swelled to over 120. They parked their bikes in a precise, disciplined formation that filled the entire street in front of the courthouse. They dismounted and stood in complete silence, a formidable wall of leather and steel. It was not a protest. It was not a threat. It was a vigil. It was a powerful, silent declaration that they were watching, that the system would be held accountable, and that the vulnerable would no longer be left to fend for themselves. Onlookers gathered, their phones held aloft, recording the incredible scene. The media descended, cameras flashing. The silent, stoic presence of the bikers was a more powerful statement than any shouted slogan. It forced everyone who saw it to reconsider their preconceived notions about the men in leather vests. They were not outlaws, they were guardians. Inside the courthouse, the sound of the idling engines was a faint, ever-present vibration, a reminder of the community that was now demanding justice for Lily and Sarah. The legal proceedings against Arthur Abernathy were a slow, grinding process, but the weight of evidence combined with the unwavering public scrutiny was insurmountable. The courtroom became a theater where the city's hidden fractures were laid bare. On one side was Abernathy, with his expensive lawyer and his desperate attempts to cling to the tatters of his respectable persona. On the other was a quiet but powerful coalition, the district attorney's office, armed with the evidence from Abernathy's own files, Sarah, recovering but resolute, and in the back of the courtroom, every single day, a rotating contingent of iron ravens. Bear was always there, sitting in the same seat in the last row. He never spoke, he never reacted, but his steady, watchful presence was a source of immense strength for Sarah. It was a silent promise that she and Lily were no longer alone. Abernathy's defense strategy was to discredit his victims. His lawyer painted Sarah as an unstable, negligent mother and portrayed the other women who came forward as disgruntled tenants with grudges. He tried to frame the entire case as a misunderstanding, a benevolent landlord's actions being twisted by a hysterical child and a menacing motorcycle gang. But the strategy backfired. The prosecutor, a sharp and empathetic woman named Maria Flores, methodically dismantled his narrative. She presented the ledgers, the illegal lockouts, the pattern of coercive control. She put Detective Miller on the stand, who testified about Lily's clarity in the crucial detail of the music box. The turning point came with Lily's testimony. To spare her the trauma of testifying in open court, her statement was given via a closed-circuit television from a quiet room, with Miss Albright and a child therapist by her side. On the screen, Lily's small face was serious and composed. She did not cry, she did not embellish. She simply told the truth in the clear, direct language of a child who had seen something wrong and knew it. She spoke of her mom's promise to come home. She described Mr. Abernathy's smile that didn't reach his eyes. She recounted the sound of the lock clicking shut. "He locked the door so Mom couldn't get in and I couldn't get out," she said, her voice small but steady. "He said he was fixing a problem. But my mom wasn't a problem, we were a family." Her simple, powerful words hung in the silent courtroom. There was no cross-examination. Even Abernathy's lawyer knew it would be a disastrous move. In that moment, everyone in the room saw Abernathy not as a respected businessman, but as a predator who had been unmasked by the courage of a 7-year-old girl. As the trial progressed, more victims found the courage to come forward. Emboldened by Sarah's strength and the visible support of the Iron Ravens, 2 other single mothers who had been terrorized by Abernathy agreed to testify. Their stories, filled with chillingly similar details of intimidation and control, painted a damning portrait of a serial abuser hiding in plain sight. The jury's deliberation was short. They returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, unlawful eviction, extortion. The judge, a stern man known for his harsh sentences in cases involving children, looked down at Abernathy with undisguised contempt. "You used your position of power not to build a community, but to prey on its most vulnerable members," the judge said, his voice ringing with authority. "You preyed on the desperation of mothers trying to provide a safe home for their children. You saw their struggle not as a reason for compassion, but as an opportunity for control. The safety of a community is measured by how it protects its children. In that, you have failed in the most monstrous way." The sentence was severe: decades in prison, with no possibility of parole for a very long time. As Abernathy was led away, his face was a mask of disbelief. He still couldn't seem to comprehend how his carefully constructed world had been brought down by a little girl and a group of men he had dismissed as thugs. In the back of the courtroom, Sarah wept with relief, leaning into Miss Albright's embrace. Bear stood up. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her a slow, single nod. It was a gesture of respect, of closure, of a promise fulfilled. He and his brothers turned and walked out of the courthouse, their boots echoing in the marble hallway. They didn't celebrate, they didn't cheer. Justice was not a victory, it was a restoration of balance. Their work was done. The conviction of Arthur Abernathy was not an end, it was a beginning. The case had exposed deep systemic failures that had allowed his predatory behavior to go unchecked for years. The community, awakened from its complacency, was now galvanized to act. The ripple effects of Lily's courage and the Raven's intervention began to spread, creating lasting, meaningful change. The first and most immediate reform came at the municipal level. The city council, under immense public pressure, convened a special session on tenant rights. Doc, the Raven's legal mind, was invited to speak. He didn't arrive in a suit, he wore his leather vest. He stood before the council members and spoke not in complex legal jargon, but in plain, powerful terms about the loopholes that men like Abernathy exploited. He proposed a series of new regulations, which the local media quickly dubbed Lily's Law. The ordinance, passed unanimously a month later, included several key provisions. It mandated a 24-hour written notice for any landlord entry, except in documented emergencies. It made illegal lockouts a criminal offense, not just a civil one, with severe penalties. Most importantly, it established a city-funded tenant advocacy office, a resource where vulnerable renters could get free legal advice and report landlord misconduct without fear of retaliation. The Iron Ravens, meanwhile, channeled the public goodwill into something tangible. They organized a massive charity ride, Ride for a Roof, to raise funds for the new advocacy office. The event drew thousands of participants, not just other motorcycle clubs, but families in minivans, students on bicycles, and local businesses who sponsored the event. They raised a staggering amount of money, enough to fund the office for its first 3 years, and create an emergency housing fund for families displaced by illegal evictions. The fund was named the Sarah and Lily Sanctuary Fund. The cultural shift was just as significant. Detective Miller, profoundly affected by the case, implemented a new training protocol within his department for wellness checks and domestic disputes involving landlord-tenant issues. Officers were now trained to look for signs of coercive control and to treat a child's testimony with the seriousness it deserved. He often used the Abernathy case as a training example, emphasizing the importance of looking past superficial appearances and listening to the smallest, most vulnerable voices. At Lily's school, Ms. Albright spearheaded a new curriculum component focused on personal safety and empowerment. They brought in counselors and social workers to teach children how to identify unsafe situations, how to trust their instincts, and who the safe adults in their community were that they could turn to for help. The lessons included discussions about tricky people who might seem nice on the surface but make them feel uncomfortable. The image of the Iron Ravens themselves was transformed in the public eye. They were no longer seen as a fringe element to be feared, but as an unconventional but vital part of the community's immune system. The mayor officially recognized the club for their civic courage and unwavering dedication to protecting the vulnerable, presenting Bear with a plaque at a town hall meeting. Bear accepted it with his usual stoicism, saying only, "We just did what anyone should have done." This wave of reform created a safer, more transparent community. Landlords across the city were put on notice. Tenants felt empowered. The systems that were supposed to protect people were strengthened and made more responsive. All of it, the new laws, the funding, the changes in policy, the shift in public consciousness, had grown from a single seed. A 7-year-old girl's decision to walk out of a dark alley and ask for help. Her small act of courage had not just saved her mother. It had rebuilt her entire community on a foundation of greater compassion and accountability. Months melted into a new season. The harsh memory of that cold, terrifying night began to fade, replaced by the warmth of a gentle spring. For Lily and Sarah, life had been quietly and beautifully remade. They lived in a new apartment on the other side of town, in a bright, sunny building with a small garden out back. The sanctuary fund had helped them with the deposit and first month's rent, giving them the fresh start they so desperately needed. Sarah had a new job at a family-owned bakery, one with better hours, and a kind boss who let her bring home unsold pastries at the end of the day. The lines of exhaustion on her face had softened, replaced by a quiet, resilient joy. Their new home was filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of laughter. The iron ravens had not disappeared from their lives. They had become family. They were a steady, reassuring presence, a circle of unconventional uncles who showed up not with drama, but with groceries, or to fix a leaky faucet, always after calling first, or just to sit on the porch and share a story. Ghost had taught Lily how to braid leather into a keychain. Doc helped her with her math homework. And Bear was her rock. He had become a grandfather figure, a quiet, solid presence she knew she could always count on. One bright Saturday afternoon, the familiar, comforting rumble of motorcycles sounded down their street. It was no longer a sound of intimidation, but a sound of safety, of home. Bear, Ghost, and Doc parked their bikes and came up the walk, carrying bags for a barbecue. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared potato salad. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table, a box of new crayons spread out before her. She was drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration. Bear came and stood behind her, looking over her shoulder. The picture was of a little girl and her mother holding hands in front of a sunny yellow house. Standing behind them, like a range of protective mountains, was a line of big men on motorcycles. Above them all, a giant, smiling sun shone down. "That's beautiful, Lilybug," Bear said, his voice a low, soft rumble. Lily looked up at him and smiled, a bright, gap-toothed grin that lit up her whole face. "That's us," she said simply. "That's our family." Bear reached into his leather vest and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped object. He placed it on the table in front of her. "I have something for you," he said. Lily unwrapped it carefully. It was her mother's old music box, the one with the ballerina. The wood was polished, the small scratches gone. Bear had taken it from the police evidence locker after the trial and had painstakingly restored it. He had fixed the broken hinge and replaced the musical mechanism. Lily opened the lid. A soft, clear melody tinkled through the warm kitchen air. The tiny ballerina spun gracefully, her painted smile serene. It was the sound of a memory healed, of something broken made whole again, not just fixed but cared for. Lily looked from the music box to Bear, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. She didn't need to say anything. He understood. He gently patted her head, his large, calloused hand surprisingly soft in her hair. Outside, the barbecue was starting. The sounds of laughter and easy conversation drifted in through the open window. Sarah came over and wrapped her arms around Lily, kissing the top of her head. The world was not always a kind place, but they had found its kindness. They had found it in the rumble of an engine, in the steadfast loyalty of a brotherhood, and in the courage of a little girl who refused to be invisible. The brotherhood would ride on, a quiet, watchful presence on the roads of a town they had helped to heal. And in a sunlit kitchen, a little girl was safe. A promise kept. The sweet, clear notes of a music box a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, someone is always listening.